Welcome to the Medical Center Hour. I'm Marcia Day Childress of the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities here at the School of Medicine. And on behalf of our center and the medical school, I'd like to welcome you to the Medical Center Hour for the academic year 2010-2011. Today marks the start of our 39th season of continuous production. It was in 1971 that this forum, the brainchild of former medical school dean Tom Hunter and visiting ethicist Joseph Fletcher, went from being an occasional series to become week in, week out, a regular part of life in this academic health center and the university, and indeed the Charlottesville community. Even now, nearly 4 decades later, the Medical Center Hour remains a special and we hope a vibrant site of cross-disciplinary conversation on provocative and evocative issues related to health, medicine, and society. We continue to be the only regular conference of the School of Medicine that's open to the entire university and to the public, and we're challenged to keep this series rich, wide-ranging, thoughtful, and stimulating for our diverse audience. And I'd just like to mention we get ideas for programs all the time, by email, by word of mouth, by letter, and other mailings. And so I'd encourage you, if you have ideas for speakers or topics, please do let us know at any time. As we start our new year, we're grateful for the School of Medicine's support, and we're also grateful for you, our audience, for your presence, and importantly, for your lively contributions to these programs. And I'd like this to be a reminder to you that these are your programs in a very fundamental way. So your voices and your views are a vital part of each session, always in the closing 10 or so minutes of the hour, and often throughout the hour. So I'd like to welcome you as our partners in this new year of rich and probing conversation. A quick reminder that Medical Center Hour can be seen on local TV. You'll find us on Comcast Channel 13 on Wednesday evenings at 8 o'clock. The programs are aired 3 weeks after the live presentation. And more conveniently, you'll also find us on YouTube. There's a dedicated Medical Center Hour channel. The link is on your handout. And the programs are usually posted on YouTube within a few weeks of the presentation. This program, our first one of the year, addresses issues of both clinical practice and governmental regulation of medicine and healthcare. It's called Playing It Unsafe: Drug Safety in a World of Imperfect Knowledge. While science-based decision-making is at the heart of drug safety, there are a host of other values and interests not easily quantified and sometimes more loudly than clearly articulated that impinge on our decisions about drug approval and availability, drug use and efficacy, and drug safety. And for all our sophistication with data sets, we still contend with considerable uncertainty and some significant ethical quandaries about how best to use scientific data in determining the safety and appropriate application of drugs, and to both fostering and protecting the health of the public. We're grateful to the university's Institute for Practical Ethics and Public Life and the occasion of the Institute's annual Hollingsworth Lecture in Practical Ethics for bringing to UVA our speaker for today, Professor R. Altacharo. Altacharo is the Warren P. Knowles Professor of Law and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where she also teaches at the School of Medicine and Public Health. She is someone, though, whose career has embraced significant government and public service, as well as distinguished academic work. And so it's not a surprise that she's currently serving as senior advisor in the Office of the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration in Washington, a position she's held since the summer of 2009. You'll find a biographical sketch of Professor Charo in your handout. As I think you'll discover this afternoon, she's an impeccably informed and eloquent spokesperson on some of the most complex yet key science, policy, and bioethical issues of our day. It's a real privilege to welcome Altacharo to the Medical Center Hour. And as we welcome her, let me call your attention to her second talk this afternoon. It's announced in your handout. It's called Of Stem Cells, Jail Cells, Holding Cells, the Politics of Stem Cell Research. It's at 4 o'clock in Clark Hall 107, and it's open to the public. So Alta Chara, and we're off.
Thank you very much. Is this, oh, I don't even need this little guy. I will endeavor to be as impeccably informed as you seem to think I am. I want to start first, however, with an apology. I need to give you some caveats. I am indeed working for the Food and Drug Administration, but I am not here speaking on behalf of the agency. I'm speaking in my academic context. I will endeavor to avoid mentioning the name of any drug, approved or unapproved, current or in the past. And I will certainly endeavor to make no comments about the FDA's performance or about the internal workings of the FDA. So whatever I say, please assume that I don't know what I'm talking about. And that will save me a lot of trouble back in Washington. It was a complete coincidence that just after I happily accepted the invitation to come down to UVA and spend time with Jim and Marcia Childress, that I received an email from the commissioner. It was an agency-wide email announcing that today, this morning, at this very time, we are now privileged to be announcing the award of the Dr. Francis O. Kelsey Award for Excellence in Courage in Protecting the Public Health. Francis Kelsey, for those of you that are not historically minded, is the FDA reviewer who, back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, saw data on a drug called, see, I'm going to mention a drug called thalidomide, which was being given to women during the course of their pregnancies. And she decided that the data on that drug were not sufficient to allow her to approve it. And on that basis, that drug did not become available in the United States except very sporadically from from non-US sources. It was, however, used widely in Europe and in Canada, and the results, many people know, was a tragic, substantial uptick in the number of children that were born with very severe disabilities because of the way the drug affected the growth of limbs, arms and legs. And back in the early 1960s, this was a very, very important subject of discussion, which was how best to react to this rash of difficult births. Dr. Kelsey saved the United States from that tragedy, and her actions have become iconic of the best of our system for ensuring drug safety. It represented a science-based approach to regulation, and it has become one of the bases on which we now go about looking at whether or not medications are safe and effective. And it is the science that is supposed to be the basis of how it is that we discover whether or not a drug is safe enough to be marketed in the United States. But the reality is that science cannot be value-free. And so with all of the information that we develop, we still find that there are values conflicts about how to use the information. The values conflicts can touch on things as broad as the degree of paternalism that's appropriate for a government to exercise when it comes to withholding things from individuals who wish to make choices for themselves. That's been a subject even to the point of Supreme Court litigation by people who said they wanted access to unapproved drugs that they thought might offer a last possible hope for what is otherwise a terminal condition without any good standard treatment. It also touches on values as fundamental as our degree of identification with the individual versus with the population as a whole when it comes to assessing the benefits and the risks of a drug. And it comes down to also values that are more kind of professionally scientific, like how we view weight of evidence or what constitutes uncertainty. And so Dr. Kelsey is actually at the FDA right now receiving this first award that's named after her. I mean, this is an amazing thing that she is here to receive this award. And I'm hoping that the webcast, the live webcast, will be available as a recorded webcast so I and others can go back and take a look at it. But I think one of the lessons that can be learned from this is that until we decide what values we want to bring to all of this good science that we're doing, we still are not going to come to an end to the struggle on how to achieve some degree of drug safety. So what I'd like to do is to talk very briefly about four things. One is a very brief presentation of some of the kind of milestones in the history of drug regulation in the United States so that one can begin to understand the context of current decision making. And then I'd like to talk about some of what I think of as being structural challenges in the area of drug safety, and they are the asymmetry of our attention with regard to drugs before and after they've been approved for marketing. The second is the framework we use and the values that we bring to that framework for risk-benefit balancing. And finally, the ethical challenges of doing the kind of research that's needed to resolve the residual questions on safety once drugs are on the market. So that's the agenda for the presentation. Again, I don't know how many people here are historically minded, but when I began studying drug regulation and began teaching drug regulation, I had a chance to begin to study the history of it. And one of the wonderful kind of like fun facts I picked up was that the 19th century, which was filled with the iconic snake oil salesman, who actually did occasionally sell snake oil, was selling what we tend to call now patent medicines. Well, the reason they were called patent medicines is because indeed they were patented, and it was considered unprofessional to patent your medicine. And therefore, if it was patented, it was considered to be cheap and somehow sleazy. And so that's why we have that phrase, and an interesting change in attitude about patents. But if you take a look at this range of patent medicines that were being peddled around the United States in the 19th century, one thing really strikes you. Actually, two things really strike you. The first is the continuity of American obsessions. Because if you go through those ads, and by the way, the FDA website has a wonderful section that shows you many, many of these advertisements. I've done these slideshows for some of my students. There is a constant preoccupation with sexuality, obesity, and constipation. Now, I'm telling you, if you take a look at American television today, you will find a similar obsession with those three bodily priorities. And medicines were always being prepared for those conditions. More seriously, what you really found in a lot of these medicines was that the operative ingredient, the active ingredient, was usually alcohol or some opiate, some derivative of opium. So of course they made people feel better. They made them feel much, much better, but it also sometimes killed them. Because the alcohol was incredibly dangerous, particularly to children, and second, the medicines were not manufactured under conditions that were remotely sanitary. And so the 19th century featured a wide range of injuries that were difficult to detect or attribute to particular causation because of the lack of communication, transportation, etc. And also the lack of a kind of scientific mentality that allowed for a more systematic examination. It wasn't until 1906 and the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906 that we really began to get a handle on this. And that was driven not even so much by drugs as it was by the filthy foods that were now becoming part of the more kind of commercialized sector of food production in the United States. The 1906 Act was the beginning of our real efforts to regulate drug safety, but it was very reactive. Basically it said if you can prove that somebody intentionally committed fraud or adulterated their food or their drug to the point of it being dangerous, then you could bring suit and try to get it off the market. That was almost useless, but it was a start. Because of course it's very hard to track them down, it's all after the fact, people are already injured, etc. The 1930s, however, featured a series of really scandalous public health problems having to do with drugs that were terribly dangerous or included toxic ingredients, and resulted in a push to regulate a little bit more comprehensively. It took almost 10 years. It got caught up in the politics of the New Deal legislation under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But 1938 featured the enactment of a statute that frankly is still the basis of all drug regulation in the United States. When you think about that, it's 72 years old, our basic framework. And that is the moment at which we began to say that drugs cannot go on the market until they have been reviewed and approved by a federal agency. Now, the approval process focused solely on danger. It was all risk-based, and it was really looking for manufacturing problems, adulterants, things like that. It was all about danger. The 1940s, beginning of the golden age of pharmaceuticals, in which there was this huge uptick in the development of pharmaceutical products, including some that actually worked, like antibiotics, led to more complicated pharmaceuticals. 1950s, we now see legislation that creates the concept of prescription-only drugs. The idea being that some drugs are intrinsically dangerous unless you have somebody who's a professional, what we call a learned intermediary, who actually can figure out how to use the drug properly, in which case it can now be made safe enough to be used. But without that expertise, it's intrinsically too dangerous and therefore can't be marketed. So that's the beginning of doctors as the primary filters between patients and their drugs. And then Frances Kelsey, thalidomide, in 1960, and in 1962, the last major piece of legislation falls into place. Ironically, although she was known for having stopped an unsafe drug from coming on the market, the main legislative innovation was to add the requirement that drugs not only have to be proven safe, but also effective. But if you think about it, asking that it be safe and effective is really the beginning of the framework we now have in which we understand safe to not mean zero risk, but we mean risk that is reasonable in the context of the benefits that the drug may offer. That's why chemotherapy agents that may be terribly dangerous and cause horrible side effects nonetheless may be considered safe, because given the power of their curative potential, that level of risk is considered acceptable. So our notion of safe is not one that's absolute, but it is entirely contextualized. And that framework really came into place about 50 going on 60 years ago now. That framework, though, from my perspective, still has some kind of structural challenges that have only partially been addressed by legislation as recently as 2007. And as I mentioned when I started there, the first one of these is the asymmetry of emphasis. If we step back and think about this for just a moment, before we approve a drug, right, we presume it's unsafe, it has to be proven safe, okay? How do we do this? In the phase 1 trials, and to some extent in the phase 2 trials, we're primarily looking for problems. We're looking for dangers. Phase 1 trials with healthy volunteers, for example, are looking really just to look how the drug metabolizes, are there any toxic effects. They're really very risk-focused, and the benefit part of the equation is only slowly coming into play in the phase 2 trials, and it's not until phase 3 trials that you really begin to see an emphasis on benefit. But phase 3 trials, which is what most of you are thinking about when you think about drug trials, are trials where the emphasis has switched quite definitively toward the issue of benefit. We're looking now to see whether as compared to placebo, or in some cases as compared to standard therapy, or standard therapy alone versus standard therapy with adjunctive new interventionist therapy, we're looking for some differential in the beneficial response. And so the trials are designed at a scale, number of patients, length of trial, to detect the necessary differential in benefit that will allow the drug manufacturer to show to the satisfaction of the government that this drug does in fact offer a benefit to patients, right? And that benefit is enough to offset whatever risks we know about. But we cannot scale those pre-approval phase 3 trials to a level that would allow us to really detect risk. If you ask what are the endpoints that those trials are designed for, the endpoints are relative benefit. They are not relative risk. Why? Well, think about it. If you want to look at an extremely rare adverse event associated with a drug, you might need tens, hundreds of thousands of people before you could see that event. That's not realistic because it's not possible to get that many people to enroll, and it would take forever to do the trial. Similarly, if you're looking for risks that only occur over a long-term period, for example, because of chronic use and the buildup of some either tolerance or toxicity, very hard to find that. Or subtle increases in common events, whether it's a subtle increase in the frequency of heart disease or some neurological phenomenon. Again, if it's a common event ordinarily occurring in the population, whether it's heart disease or dementia, it may be very difficult to pick up a very subtle increase in the rate of that through your phase 3 pre-approval trials. So we understand that the pre-approval stage really, at the end of the day, tells us more about probable benefit than it does about probable risk. It can detect high frequency, significant risks, but it can't necessarily detect all the range of risks we're interested in. And even given that, we have to ask whether or not the benefits themselves are completely real. Because if you go look at those populations we use in those clinical trials, in order to make the size of the trial manageable, we do a lot of things to simplify things. We tend to do trials with people who are between the ages of 18 and 55. Right? So we've got a degree of homogeneity in terms of degrees of bodily maturity. We tend, if possible, depending upon the particular kind of trial, to control for as many variables variables as we can. So we look for people who are not particularly polypharmic, they're not taking a lot of other drugs. We often look for people that are not suffering from a lot of comorbidities, because we really want to be able to get as small a number as possible to give us the most detectable effect if possible of the particular thing we're testing. And with all those other confounding factors, we'd have to increase the size of the trial or the length of the trial in order to be sure we knew what we were looking at. And finally, the people in the trial are, not always, but often, more closely supervised than would be patients in the real world getting medical care the way we do. So in all these different ways, the benefits that we can detect in a trial may not necessarily translate into the benefits in the real world, where the people who are taking these drugs may be taking them less religiously, maybe taking them in conjunction with other drugs or a wider variety of nutritional supplements and herbal supplements and natural remedies, maybe taking them while they're also suffering from any number of other illnesses. And so our ability to predict the benefits can be difficult. Yes?
I was wondering if I could interrupt and ask a question about the effectiveness.
Please do.
Yeah, because I have to leave at 1. My question is that I feel like the FDA's definition of effectiveness can sometimes be too stringent, and I'll give an example. If you could imagine Herceptin, which is for a target is a monoclonal antibody against HER2. If you could imagine that as a small molecule where we don't know HER2 biology. If you put that through the FDA, that is not effective against all breast cancer. It's actually just the same as placebo. But if you target it against HER2 positive tumors, it is effective. So how does the FDA characterize like stratification of patients in terms of effectiveness instead of all patients? So like,
if I may try to answer you. First, I'm absolutely not going to answer you because I will not talk about what the FDA does or doesn't do. Okay. As I said before, I'm not speaking for the agency. I will say, though, that your question touches on an emerging question about how to identify the relevant populations and the particular match between the population and the drug. And sometimes that's through the use of genetic testing. In other cases, it may have to do with other factors that you're looking for in a patient's history or patient's physiology. So-called personalized medicine is very much a topic on everybody's minds, and I'll direct you to a recent New England Journal of Medicine piece co-authored by the FDA Commissioner Peggy Hamburg and Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health, that lays out the joint strategy of the NIH and the FDA to address both the research questions and the regulatory challenges of combining this kind of diagnostic information or predictive information with the particular drug approval process. Okay? Anyway, what I was trying to get to at this point was simply that the pre-approval process is one that is focused more on benefit than on risk at the end of the day, and that even with benefit, there are questions about how effectively, no pun intended, it can in fact predict the benefit in the real world. Now let's look at the post-approval period, because my point here had been the asymmetry. In the post-approval period, we have very little organized collection of information about benefit. So what had been pre-approval, a kind of growing emphasis on benefit, as imperfect as it was, now switches to an emphasis on risk. We have mechanisms for collecting risk information. We have physicians who are obligated to send in adverse event reports. The pharmaceutical companies are supposed to send in adverse event reports. There are any number of attempts at things like meta-analyses and observational studies. But the fact is, we are looking for risk information, again, however imperfect, but we don't necessarily collect benefit information with the same degree of enthusiasm. Yes, there's benefit information that comes out because it happens that an individual physician or physician researcher is now going to do some kind of trial, or it may be through the anecdotal reports that you see, the case reports that are published in the medical journals, or simply the common wisdom that's passed from one generation of physicians and nurses and pharmacists to the next. But realistically, at a regulatory level, we simply don't have the same degree of formalized collection of benefit information. So what happens in the post-market period is that we begin to see all sorts of evidence of a possible problem with the drug, problems that may even not have been able to be detected in the pre-approval period, things like these subtle increases in the rate of a frequently occurring problem, or very rarely occurring problem. And yet, at this point, there's a perception that is not, by the way, in accord with the legal standard, but a perception that the presumption has switched. Whereas before approval, it was presumed that a drug is unsafe till proven safe. There is this kind of instinct that once it's been approved, we can presume it's safe until proven unsafe. If you actually look at the statute, the words are the same pre and post approval. The obligation on the manufacturer is always to have a drug that is, quote, safe, whatever that means. The presumptions do not change, but in practice, in instinct, because it's ever been approved, there is a tendency to view it as safe until proven unsafe. And so, the combination of a lack of focus on benefit and the nature of the kind of evidence that you get about risk tends to result in tremendous fights over two things I want to talk about briefly. One is weight of evidence, and the other are the values that we bring to bear on the question of how we interpret the evidence we have. You know, on weight of evidence, it tends to be the case that we view randomized clinical trials as the gold standard. Randomized controlled, placebo-controlled trials, as the gold standard for proving anything. And indeed, there are tremendous strengths in those particular trials. But in the post-market period, that is often not the kind of evidence that we're getting. As I said, we're getting individual adverse event reports where you have to make very fine judgments about causation. And we're getting observational studies in which the problem is that we've not been able to control for the prescription of this versus that drug. So we have no idea, or only an imperfect idea, of what the confounding factors might be that we need to understand to evaluate the observational data. We have meta-analyses that take all of this imperfect data and mush that together, and in some ways only multiply the effects of the imperfect and uncertain data that we have, because we're taking trials that may have different designs, they may have different degrees of statistical power, they may have, slightly different controls, and very subtly, if you're doing meta-analyses of published trials, you may have a tremendous problem with publication bias, because we tend to publish trials that have a positive result much more than trials that have a negative result. And so meta-analyses also pose tremendous challenges, and yet this is the kind of information we tend to have in a post-market setting. And so for people that are focused on the idea of risk in the context of benefit, here's what we've got. A belief in benefit that may or may not be justified because we've never had the kind of organized collection of benefit data to prove or disprove the predictions based on the pre-approval clinical trials, coupled with imperfect data and imperfect analyses of the risks that we're beginning to become aware of over time. Couple this also with the degree of reliance that begins to develop in the medical community and the patient community on a particular drug, and just the familiarity, the habituation people have to a particular drug that makes for a kind of instinctive sense that this drug is probably safe or probably good. And you've got a situation that is rife for real conflict over what to do when you get one of these ambiguous signals of a possible problem with a drug. Do we view that as something that is in fact evidence of a problem, or do we view it as evidence that there might be a problem that requires further research? These are two different reactions. Now, part of what leads to the resolution of these things is a set of discussions that often seem to be about things like the weight of the evidence and a critique of the meta-analysis or whatever, but actually are unspoken debates about certain values. And in some ways, some of those value debates track loosely the difference between a clinical approach and an epidemiological approach to drug safety. Let me explain, and let me again emphasize this is a very crude proxy and not intended to paint all clinical physicians or all epidemiologists one way or another. From a clinical point of view, you tend to think about a drug and its safety in terms of the actual patient ahead in front of you. So there tends to be a kind of placing yourself in the physician's room with the patient and asking things like, if I am a learned intermediary, a professional, can I figure out how to use this drug? By looking at the individual patient with all the little details that may or may not have been variables in these trials, can I figure out if it's likely or unlikely the drug is going to work, likely or likely it's going to have side effects, likely or unlikely the patient will be able to conform to the prescription regime, and make adjustments based on these very specific individual assessments. And I may ask, should the patient have a high degree of autonomy in deciding whether or not to take on certain kinds of risks? So this more kind of patient-focused clinical decision-making may very easily lead one to conclude that signs that there may be risks out there on a population basis, because you're looking at the number of case reports, for example, don't necessarily translate into the notion that this is no longer safe for your patient, and the decision on the part of the clinician, the clinical approach might be that the drug is still safe when used right. right? And when used right is filled with all sorts of caveats. Whereas from an epidemiological point of view, you assume there's going to be a certain rate of misuse. A certain number of doctors that wind up prescribing it when in the end it turns out it shouldn't have been prescribed. They may or may not have known, right? A certain number of times that the patient simply will or will not accord with the medication schedule, et cetera, and that there's simply going to be a certain number of people who are harmed. And so you really switch from an individualized notion of care to one that is a population-based notion of care, and you get very different values. The epidemiologists are saying, look, as a matter of public health and population, we don't want to have X thousand people hurt. And as individual clinical judgments, like, yes, but I've got this patient, but I think I can help with this drug, and I want to use this drug. So my notion about whether it's safe enough is very different. That's one of the basic kinds of value debates. Second is this fight over how much to rely on the pre-approval evidence of benefit. Now, I've already talked about some reasons why it might not predict having to do with the stylized nature of clinical trials. But there's another kind of thing that happens in more kind of population-focused thinking. If you've got a drug whose risks are fairly immediate because the toxicities are such that you're going to experience the risk in the near term, but the benefits won't necessarily accrue for many years. For example, it's going to reduce the possibility that you will develop cardiac problems. Then some people doing population studies might discount the benefit of preventing cardiac problems because a certain percentage of those people won't live long enough to enjoy the benefit. They're going to get run over by a bus. They'll die of cancer. There'll be other reasons why they would die before they get the benefit. And so that analysis would lead you to discount the benefits that occur far in the future while giving full credit to the risks that will occur in the near future. And that will change your risk-benefit balance for reasons that have nothing to do with the drug per se, but with the way you view the analysis of a population, right? Again, if you're a clinical mind, you would never ever think this way. And if you're one of these kind of population statisticians, you might always think this way. If you're an economist, we know they discount everything, you definitely think this way, right? Next, another kind of fundamental philosophical question is how you value the sheer availability of drugs, the so-called I can't even pronounce it, armamentarium. Please don't record that. For some, the notion of having an additional drug available, even if it's in the same class, is one that makes them feel more confident that they will figure out how to help the patient. If the patient doesn't do well on this drug, maybe the patient will do well on that drug. Or maybe there's an issue of payment. Maybe one is still on patent and the other one's gone generic, and affordability is a question for your patient. Or maybe it has to do with the local HMO or other insurance carrier and the particular formulary that this patient is on. So that the sheer availability of choice for some people is going to be considered an intrinsic benefit of every new drug. Whereas for others, it may be that there's no intrinsic benefit to choice, and the only way that a drug can be considered beneficial is if it actually works better than something out there now, or at least works better for some particular group of people than what's out there now. In other words, it has to have a differential benefit in order to have a benefit at all. And that choice in and of itself is not a value. Indeed, there's another group of people for whom the notion is that we simply use way too many drugs, and in fact it's actually to our detriment to keep approving drugs because it only generates a kind of culture of taking drugs. And it is absolutely true that we now tend to have many more people on many more prescriptions than we ever have in the history of the United States, and more prescriptions chronically. Creating all sorts of problems of polypharmacy that are very difficult, if not impossible, to study. This kind of philosophical division of opinion is profound because for many, many situations, drugs simply prove themselves to be better than nothing or non-inferior to something, but never are proven to be better than anything for anybody in any setting, right? And indeed, thinking again about the clinical trials, how hard would that be? There's so many different variations on what could be a subpopulation. I'm sorry that the gentleman who asked the question about personalized medicine had to leave, because that's exactly the issue. You might be able to find some small segment, but how would you know where to look? How many small segments would you have to test, and how long would you have to test to identify it? So if we're going to presume that a drug is useless until proven specifically differentially beneficial, we may find ourselves waiting a very long time. On the other hand, if we don't wait for that, we're simply putting more and more drugs on the market without having a good sense of how they compare to one another for the population as a whole or for any particular person. Now, finally, we have real differences of opinion about how well we can control the risks of drugs once they're on the market. Up until 2007, the ability to control the use of drugs post-market was really limited. And by and large, the government had the possibility of, excuse me, changing what's on the label, which gives information about known high frequency or serious side effects and adverse risks, or taking the drug entirely off the market, which was, by the way, legally a very, very difficult, tedious process, right? And on top of that, to recall the drug, or even to ask a company to recall a drug, which is more often how it's done, is something that many people used to call the nuclear option. Because the drug may be very useful for 10,000 people, but it's really bad for 100,000 people. And so taking the drug off the market leaves that 10,000 with very inferior choices, and leaves their physicians very frustrated at not having the option. But there was real debate about whether or not labels had any effect at all. And there's certainly a lot of empirical data that suggests that neither physicians nor patients are really up to date on all the information on those labels, and empirical evidence that suggests that our effort to thread the needle between too many and too few conditions and adverse events listed and warnings listed on those labels has not been perfected yet, right? Too many and people kind of dismiss them all, too few and you don't actually tell people about some of them, and nobody's come up with the magic formula, magic algorithm for that. And so one of the issues had always been how much confidence we have that once a drug is out there, we can do anything about it to titrate its risks. 2007, you saw a major legislative effort, so-called FDA, I can't even remember what it stands for, but it followed much of the recommendation language that was written into the Institute of Medicine report of 2006 that I was really, really lucky to be part of, which went through a critique of the drug safety system and talked about the need to have many more nuanced kinds of options in the post-market setting. And that law has created many more opportunities for limitations on drugs in the post-market setting, whether it's the mandatory use of registries so that we can track people more easily, or it is limits on distribution, or limits on the nature of the professionals who can distribute, or it is stronger, more effective means of requiring post-market clinical trials to follow up on things that were detected, but only slightly in the pre-approval period. It's too early to know how effective these will be. I mean, it's only 2 years, 3 years out from FDA, and we all know that the drug pipeline is much longer than that. It'll take a long time to see how that changes things. But it has already raised, and this is the last thing I want to mention before I open it up for conversation, it's already raised to some extent one ethical dilemma that I don't think we had focused on a lot before, and it's the ethical dilemma of post-market trials. Now, we understand that it may be perfectly ethical to do post-market trials where you're doing comparative benefit trials, and you truly don't know which drug is better or which drug is better for which population. Okay, that's pretty much like what we tend to do anyway when we're looking originally to see if a drug is effective even against placebo. But what if we have drugs that are predicted to have identical or virtually identical levels of benefit for the general population, and the only thing you're trying to figure out is which one's more dangerous? That's an entirely different problem. And this problem can come up with a number of different kinds of drugs. And it may be something that may really require fairly large-scale, long-term studies, because we're looking again at a slight uptick in an otherwise common problem that is caused by many different conditions, right? And we've seen a number of examples of various forms of heart disease being the focus of exactly that kind of concern. Subtle increases in heart disease or in other kinds of cardiac-related events from some drugs but not others that seem so closely related that there is an expectation that the benefits are identical, or even that we have pre-approval data that suggests that in fact they are identical. How do you do this? Is it ever ethical to have a trial in which you ask people to enroll and tell them the point of the trial is to figure out which people die more often, the ones in group A or the ones in group B, you're both going to be cured at the same rate? Is it ethical to even offer that? And many people argued no. In fact, Public Citizen, which tends to be a strong critic of much of the pharmaceutical industry, had argued that it was intrinsically unethical to do this. The Institute of Medicine was asked to report on this, and just in the last couple of months, it was in July, they came out with a short piece that tackled this very question. And to put it in some context, I'd ask us to remember that going back to those phase 1, phase 2 trials that I mentioned earlier, those are trials where the only thing we're looking for, phase 1 particularly with healthy volunteers, the only thing we're looking for is danger. So we do, in fact, routinely have research trials in which we recruit people solely to find out whether or not we're going to kill them. Well, that's, I mean, an exaggeration, but it's a deliberate exaggeration for effect, right? We solely want to find out whether or not it is exposing them to some kind of danger. Then hopefully we'll withdraw them quickly enough that they don't actually experience it. But there have been some terrible, terrible situations in which people really were horribly injured by a phase 1 trial. So it's not necessarily the case that we have collectively decided it's intrinsically unethical to deliberately expose people to danger, right? But we have, according to the IOM, implicitly adopted certain principles that they would like to see better articulated. Like, you don't do this unless you absolutely have to, which is why you do so much work on animals, so much work on in vitro testing, why there's so much interest now in stem cell modeling, and we'll be talking about this afternoon, as a way to avoid unnecessarily increasing the number of these phase 1 trials, but instead screening out things that are going to turn out to be dangerous with other mechanisms. Second, you only do it when it's actually a really important question. You don't expose people to this kind of choice of volunteering for this kind of trial unless there's really some important social need for the information. Third, you have to be sure people are truly volunteering, and that means truly understanding what they're getting themselves into. And you could quite naturally ask, why in the world would anybody enroll? But if you go back to phase 1 trials, I can tell you, and it's the same reason that some of the UVA students in this audience or elsewhere on campus have enrolled, it's because you pay them money. We like to think of research as an altruistic exercise, but the fact of the matter is we operate it like a business, glossed over with lots of altruistic conversation. This is me being very cynical. This is very much my personal opinion. I'm definitely not speaking for the agency, right? But from my perspective, there is an open question, and I will leave it as a question, not an answer, about why it is that we continue to talk about the participation in research trials as if it is some altruistic endeavor, instead of recognizing it as another form of paid labor for many people. Not the people who are sick, that's a much more subtle problem, but for the healthy people or the people who are in these danger-only trials, I'd say. What would it mean if we understood it as a form of work in which you had minimum wage, maximum hours, wage and conditions of labor, unionization for professional research ethics, research trial patients. In other words, if we were to approach it the way the people who subscribe to Guinea Pig Zero do, which is an interesting little newsletter of people that trot around the country enrolling in trials to make money, right? But this is, I think, part of our dilemma. Because as we move into an era in which we're more and more focused on the long-term safety of our drugs, we are going to need to have more and more information about differential risk, and we're going to need to face up to the ethical dilemma and to the reality of what we're actually doing to entice people in order to decide again for ourselves if this is the way we want to conduct research, and if so, what are the rules by which we'll do it. I'd also say that part of the asymmetry problem may possibly be addressed in the future by the new emphasis on comparative effectiveness research, which is kind of trickling down through both the private and the public sector. Private sector, Kaiser out in California, they've been doing this for a long time as they decided what things to keep and not keep on their formularies. Now we're seeing more money thrown at it through the recent reforms in the healthcare financing and insurance provisions. So we may finally find ourselves in a situation where this asymmetry is beginning to diminish, and we're beginning to look at risk-benefit before and after marketing in a more comprehensive and symmetrical fashion. And that may handle part of the problem. But I'd suggest that until we also better articulate the actual values debates that underlie how we use the evidence from all these tests, and how we tolerate the uncertainties, and how we imagine the appropriate role of the patient, the physician, and the government in the kind of constraints that we will place on the system, that even with all the new data and even with the new symmetry of focus, we are still going to find ourselves debating how it is that we can achieve an adequate level of public safety that will actually improve public health. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. And now we have several minutes for your questions and comments. I'd ask you to please identify yourself before you ask your question.
Al Roll, Department of Pediatrics. by not mentioning any names of drugs or how you do trials, you so cleverly put at the major one with the diabetes drug, which will remain unnamed. But my question is more from a regulatory point of view. Whether it's registry or phase 4 studies have been agreed to by a number of companies and never done. From the regulatory legislative point of view, what would the FDA have to do to say, look, you promised within 3 years to have safety data, if that's what you want to call them, on 1,300 people. You haven't done it. What are their, what is the range of possibilities that could be done for that particular problem?
Prior to 2007, there was very, very little that the agency could do because its powers were quite limited. For one thing, surprisingly, it could not require a label change. So for example, if there had been a request to do a phase 4 study to look for a particular problem and the phase 4 study was not completed, the agency could not force them to put on the label that this risk exists, right? They couldn't do it. It had to be by the company's own decision. And as I said earlier, to withdraw the drug was something that people resisted because of its kind of exaggerated effects on other people and the difficulty of forcing it again through legislative means. Post-2007, there are additional remedies, additional sanctions that can be placed on companies that fail to live up to post-marketing promises. They are now called risk evaluation and mediation strategies, REMS. So post-market trials is one of several that companies can be required to commit to as a condition of approval. And I'd have to go back to the statute to be sure of the complete list of sanctions that are available, but typically they include monetary sanctions, and now, of course, the agency has the power to force a change in the label. The recall of a drug still tends to be very difficult because of due process requirements, because it's a property interest at that point. But there's many more ways that we can unilaterally act that we couldn't act, that the agency could act that we couldn't act before.
Hi, this is on. My name is Carolyn Engelhardt. I teach health policy here. Thank you for a captivating talk without any PowerPoint slides. But my question is this. In recognizing the asymmetry between risks and benefits in the pre- and post-approval of drugs, I'm curious if the emphasis on benefits in the post-approval realm has something to do with it hitting the market and becoming revenue generating. And to that end, I'm then curious how you might feel about a policy change, or how you feel about the policy we currently have about direct-to-consumer advertising and its role in the market.
Well, first I want to clarify one thing, which is that I actually don't think there really is an emphasis on benefits in our kind of regulatory approach when it comes to post-market. Quite the contrary. I think we have a more organized way of getting at risk information but not getting at benefit information. That may change with the comparative effectiveness research, although that will be designed with a different goal in mind than the ones that a regulatory agency might have. But to answer your question more directly about the effect of advertising, there have been many really interesting studies about this. And the common wisdom is that it is a good news, bad news phenomenon. And again, it's about which you care about more. The good news is that the advertising rules, which have definitely been liberalized since the 1990s, basically by saying that you could have an adequate disclosure that gave major information and then gave a place to get more, like a website, a phone number, and that would be sufficient as opposed to what we used to see, which is the full-page magazine ads with a full page of small block, small print on the back. And this is what opened up the possibility of television and radio ads. And I really love them too, with the pictures of smiling people while they recite all these horrible side effects. Hoping that you'll be watching but not listening, right? I mean, you gotta love it. But there's no question that that has resulted in, on the one hand, higher degrees of awareness among patients about both the fact that they may have a disease, and second, the fact that there may be a way to treat it. So it actually has been shown to improve, for some people, the care that they get because of this kind of recognition of options. It also has been a, like every other kind of advertising campaign, a market-creating mechanism so that many more people think of things as a disease that before really wouldn't have been considered a disease. In some ways, it really goes into this problem of the definition of a disease being something we can treat, right? So if your legs move a lot at night, then we can treat that, so now that's a disease. I mean, that's everybody's favorite example. And I gotta confess, I know nothing about the true problem of true restless leg syndrome. So for anybody here who works in that area, I apologize for the facetious nature of the comment. But no question about it, just like we convinced people that they've got halitosis back in the 1960s, and it was, you know, you got bad breath, go brush your teeth, right? That became a kind of treatable condition. Advertising does that. The bad news, in some ways, is that it is also demonstrably affecting physician practice. Because patients come in and they have a very strong notion of what it is that they have and what it is that they need. And in today's kind of medical practice settings, it is often the case that you don't have the time to try and argue with a patient who's got this kind of fixed notion. And if it's not so bad, then you might just do it, right? I mean, it's like, it's not going to hurt them. I got something else I would ordinarily prescribe, but, you know, what the heck? They're happy, I'm happy, next patient. And, you know, that happens because everything has been so kind of sped up and driven by, you know, various kinds of corporate structures in the way we deliver healthcare. And that is not ideal. Because in an ideal world, physicians are free of both the pressures of companies and their detail people, and also free of the pressures of patients coming in with a preconception of what they need. And it would in fact have a kind of perfectly non-judgmental, perfect universe of information that they have time to absorb and an infinite amount of time with each patient to figure out what the exactly right thing to do is. So do I think direct-to-consumer advertising is good or bad? No, I think it's a very mixed blessing, and I keep watching the data to decide whether it's more good or more bad. And the agency takes, I'm not speaking on behalf of the agency. Did I say that?
Alta,
John?
thanks a lot for a great talk. I'm John Aris. I teach bioethics in the college. Alta, I want to take you back to these studies that you're contemplating, comparing drugs that are more or less equivalent efficacy, but there's a fear that one of them might kill people, you know, in greater numbers than the other. And you've noted that groups like Public Citizen have come out strongly against such studies, arguing that they're in principle unethical. I tend to think, I mean, I like to think of myself as a morally sensitive person, okay? But this seems to me to be another example where Public Citizen has shown us a kind of inverse relationship between moral intensity and moral plausibility. Okay?
I'm going to use that next time I talk to one of them.
No, they're nice people. But I mean, it seems to me that this is precisely the kind of case that cries out for extensive clinical research. I don't view this as a special case at all. I don't view this as a case demanding even a higher level of justification than your garden variety clinical trial. So what am I missing here? I mean, because I mean, the point here is to discover what potentially bad things that drugs in common usage are doing to people. The people who are in a trial like this, if they weren't in a trial, they'd be out there in the wild getting these drugs willy-nilly from whoever's writing the prescriptions.
Well, you know, John, I think that, I don't think you're actually missing it. I think what you're resisting is the argument that clinical trials are justified largely on the basis that people enter it with a true sense of clinical equipoise. I truly don't know which is going to turn out to be better for me. And so it makes sense to go into a trial because I might turn out better off. And so the risks that might be differential are offset also by the benefits that might be differential. And that this kind of lack of information is part of the intrinsic justification of the trial, right? But where it is only a question of differential danger, but the benefit is likely to be the same in both cases, the view is, well, then you really aren't getting much of a benefit by enrolling at all. I understand your point that in the absence of information, but it's a little bit like the problem of let somebody else be in the trial. You want to be a free rider.
Isn't there a big benefit to not being killed by a drug? and for the rest of us to learn about that.
That is absolutely right, but it's a free rider problem. It's actually much better for somebody else to be in the trial and to benefit from the information that was generated with them. It's the same problem we have with vaccines, right? Much better to be the one unvaccinated person in a perfectly vaccinated population, right?
Yes.
It's the free rider problem. But there's a oh God, I had a thought in my head and it's just fled. Oh, I hate when that happens. Don't you hate when that happens? Is there a neurologist here who can explain what just happened? It was brilliant. I'm sure it was brilliant.
Do you want another question?
Yeah, please, because then I'll probably answer the old one when the new one comes.
I'm Jim Craig. I'm a retired physician, and I'd like your comment on the argument for use of a drug with limited efficacy and some risk in a group of patients with a fatal illness for which there is no effective therapy. Sort of the argument of what harm can it do?
Right. Well, as promised, I actually remembered the thing I wanted to say to John. I'm now going to answer that, and I'm going to answer your question as well very briefly. John, the other thing I wanted to say was that if we think about it, not from the point of view of research ethics generally, but of the professional ethics of physicians, looked at from that point of view, how could a physician who's got an obligation to provide care to a patient say, I have 2 drugs, and I'm pretty confident that both of them would do just as much for you, but we have a faint suspicion that one of them might be more dangerous than the other, and I'd like to enroll you in a trial. That, as a question of professional ethics, now sounds quite different. How can you actually offer that to your patient? I mean, because really, we all understand that after just one small hint, we're not at perfect equipoise. We're not at perfect indifference on danger. We run these trials because we have a suspicion that one might be more dangerous than the other. You're shaking your head, but I'm just trying to explain to you what you found to be morally implausible, but nonetheless morally intense reasoning on the part of a public citizen.
Okay.
I'm doing my best. For the gentleman on the right, that was really at the heart of the case that was brought by the Abigail Alliance. This is a group that was named after a woman who died while a drug was still in phase 2 trials, was not available to her in the United States. She had a particular cancer and subsequently was approved by the government for use in the United States, but by now, of course, she was long dead. And the frustration on the part of her family led to the founding of this organization, which went all the way up to the Supreme Court, basically saying that if there, you know, in this right to life argument that has been focused so much on the issue of abortion, we've completely forgotten an entirely different right to life argument, which is the right of terminal patients to grasp at any last hope without having the government stop them by saying that nobody's allowed to sell the drug, right? And it was very interesting to find that the court did not respond to that argument because the main response was really a public goods argument, not a personal autonomy argument. It was a, if we let people do this, then we'll never be able to get to the point of having real trials because everybody's going to be flocking to drugs before they're proven, and we're never going to get the public good that Dr. Aris was just referring to when really we benefit from knowing something. And Zeke Emanuel, who at the time was the chief of bioethics at the National Institutes of Health, wrote a very strong piece about the need to essentially limit autonomy in order to get that information. That said, it's worth noting that in the 1980s in San Francisco, ACT UP became a very, very powerful force for the then terminally ill AIDS patients because it wanted access to AZT before it was even proven. And yet we needed to prove one way or the other if AZT would actually help, or any retroviral. And so something called parallel track was created so that some people went into clinical trials. But if you couldn't go into clinical trials, you weren't eligible, you were too sick or whatever, you might get access to unproven medication that way. And indeed, there is an entire legislative and regulatory pathway now that lets people get unapproved drugs outside of a clinical trial. I will end this response with one comment though. Even if they can legally get it, and even though we legally are able to actually reimburse companies for the cost of producing it for those people, it's unlikely they're going to have it because until it's been approved, companies are often not interested in the investment it would take to scale up manufacturing to a point where they could supply the desired amount. And they're not going to scale up until they actually know the drug's going to be approved, because otherwise it's an investment with no profit at the end. And further complicating it is that if any of those people who get the drug before approval but outside a trial have an adverse event, which many of them are going to have, because we're talking now about terminal desperate people, that adverse event has to be considered in the regulatory process of approving the drug. So it is a true catch-22 kind of situation here, in which making the drug available to people will probably not make it all that available, and to the extent it does, it'll probably prevent it from ever being available to anybody else. You gotta love it.
And I think we loved it. Thank you very much.